Hey, y'all, it's Michelle with SLP Full Disclosure. Welcome to the podcast today. I'm so excited that we have a wonderful guest joining us from the University of Mississippi. Hotty toddy, Dee.
Hotty toddy.
I'm so excited that you're here. So, I actually stalked the University of Mississippi's website, and that's how I found you. So, I know
Oh,
you're probably like, oh my goodness, how in the world did she get in touch with me? But I was so intrigued by the work that you do with language and literacy. And that is what we're going to be talking about today, language and literacy, how they're different, how they're intertwined, and all of those things.
how
So,
much
thank
fun is that?
I know, right? And I was just telling her before we started recording that I have a couple of kids that I'm working with. I'm like, we might turn this into a case study. If we have time at the end, I might ask you a couple of specific questions. So, well, before we get started and get into the nitty gritty, I want to give you guys a little bit of background on Dee Lance. Dee has worked in the field of speech language pathology since 1988. Currently, she is a professor and serves as chair in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at the University of Mississippi. During her time in higher education, she has served as a clinical educator and developed a specialty clinic for children with reading difficulties. As a didactic course instructor, she has developed and taught a variety of courses, but her favorite topics are language acquisition and disorders. Her research interests center around reading difficulties in children with language disorders. She has directed 34 undergraduate and master's research projects and 8 doctoral research projects. In addition, she has collaborated on several research projects on both the state and national levels. Since 2006, Dee has served as an accreditation site visitor for Council on Academic Programs for Audiology and Speech Language Pathology and a candidacy site visitor for CAA since 2012. I almost got through that without making a mistake. The
It's a
didactic and all of
hard
those things.
title.
Articulation is hard, right? A lot of things have to
It
happen for
is.
speech to be clear, and that's okay. We make mistakes sometimes. I always tell my kids that. It's all right. Sometimes we all have bumpy speech, right? So,
Disfluency spoken here.
yes, yes, I love that. Okay, so we're going to be talking about language and literacy, two very different topics, but also topics that are greatly intertwined. So I looked up the definition. I mean, I know what language is and I know what literacy is, but to give us a specific definition, I looked it up and I was pretty spot on. It says that language enables us to express thoughts and emotions, while literacy is what allows us to decipher written information. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, language and literacy and how they're intertwined. So let's go back to the very, very beginning, Dee.
Oh my,
Why?
that's a long time
I
ago.
know it's a long time ago for me too. So, why is it important for speech pathologists, caregivers, anyone really who is caring for an infant toddler to focus on that language in those early developing years?
So there are a couple of things I can say, but I'm gonna start with something that I read years ago, and it has influenced me significantly, and that is that children who write like books and talk like books are children who are academically successful.
Wow.
And so it's not that they are any smarter. It's not that they are any more capable. It's that those kids who have good language are rewarded in ways in school that children who are not strong with language skills are not rewarded. And it comes back down to so even with our math problems,
Hmm.
where math is a universal language, that
Hmm.
I can do a math problem and using math symbols, somebody who doesn't speak English will know exactly what I have done.
Right.
It is a language in and of itself. But our students have to write in English
Hmm.
how they solved the problem.
Right.
And so even those kids that are good in math, if they're not good with language, are penalized.
Hmm.
And so this notion of having of literacy and of our children needing to be able to read and write and understand on grade level, both fiction and expository discourse, or that discourse of the classroom, the
Hmm.
discourse or the language of the classroom, the language of textbooks.
Right.
It's critical. And what we know about language acquisition is that the vocabulary of a 2-year-old will predict the vocabulary of a 12-year-old.
Mhm.
And
Just like the
so
social that social piece.
yes,
The social interaction in preschool is an indicator for success as an adult.
yes. And
Mhm,
so we know that kids who have language impairment as preschoolers are very likely not to be, you know, have SLI or language impairment
mhm,
and move once they get into school, 3rd, 4th grade, maybe 6th grade, to
mhm.
being like having a language learning disability.
Right, because when you get into those grades, we're not talking about that basic vocabulary. In 3rd grade, and maybe even in 2nd grade now, because the the rigor of the curriculum is just unbelievable. They're gonna have to start making inferences and drawing conclusions and coming up with the main idea and those kinds of things that they're going to have to use that language in order to do.
But they're going to have to decipher
Right.
what is being said to them.
Mhm,
And so whether it is that they've been given something in writing and have to
mhm.
read or decode and comprehend quickly enough to get through the assignment in the time that is allowed, so they're gonna have to be fluent readers in the material that they have been given.
Okay, that brings me to a question, and I had this question later on, so I think this might be a good time to ask you
Okay.
this. So, I've been doing this 25 years, and I did a podcast with my daughter, who is a middle school math teacher, and we talked about that language and math piece. So, it's interesting that you brought that up. But she also has dyslexia. And I have seen kids in my career who are the most beautiful, fluent readers. You give them a text, grade level, sometimes even above grade level, beautifully fluent, and they read it with ease, but they have 0 comprehension of what they read. How does that happen? How can you have a beautifully fluent reader that they can't comprehend what they're reading versus my daughter who had dyslexia, who had difficulty with that decoding piece and getting through the actual text, but somehow she had average to above average comprehension.
It's language.
It's just language. It's
It's
just how
lang
our brain works.
it is so if a child can't comprehend linguistic input,
Mhm,
whether it is oral or written,
mhm,
because written language is linguistic input,
mhm.
then it's language. And so they don't have a decoding problem.
They have a language delay.
Or there is a language and see, and I don't like the word delay.
Okay.
It either you are performing at the level expected
Uh-huh.
based on your age in comparison to peers of similar age and background,
Mhm.
or you're not.
Right.
And if you're not, and I find the term delay sometimes is a way to soften
Yeah.
the label
Mhm.
as opposed to providing the label. And when we think about counseling with parents, labels have there are
Implications.
benefits and there are, problems with applying a label to an individual. But naming that thing and making it separate from the individual can actually help them reconstruct their narrative about themselves in terms
Mhm.
of, "It's not me, it's that."
Right.
And so this doesn't have anything to do with my self-worth. This is just how my brain is wired,
Mhm.
and we call it that. The
Mhm.
language impairment or,
They
you
want
know
a reason.
yes,
It's the reason.
it's the reason, and when we provide that label, then that reason can become separate from the individual and their self-worth and their
Mhm.
self-esteem.
Yeah.
And then we can start managing, a little bit of acceptance maybe,
Mhm.
and strategies.
Strategies, yes.
You know what I
What
mean?
do
So,
you do?
what's that
What do
thing?
you do? Yeah, I
Yes.
mean, and, when I was working in early intervention, I never used language delay. I mean, we're talking about kids birth to 3, right?
Mhm.
I always referred to those kids as just late talkers because they I don't know. I don't know if they're actually truly language delayed from birth to 3 when they don't have really a lot of experiences and you just can't really tell. So
No.
I always just talked about them. I tell their parents they're late talkers.
Yeah.
And then but you're right. It's when I think back to my daughter, she had amazing language. Like and we had lots of experiences. I mean, we went and we did and I read to her every single day. So she was able to comprehend, but whew, getting through it was tough. And I remember it's funny. Let me ask you this real quick, and we had not talked about this. that phonics-based reading versus whole language reading, because Mia, my daughter, I remember when she was in the 2nd grade and I asked her, I said, "When you don't know a word, when you're reading with" well, I'm not gonna say her name. "When you're reading with Miss Teacher and you don't know a word, how does she what happens?" And she said, "She just tells me the word and we move on." And it was at that point that it dawned on me, she's teaching her whole language. She's not teaching a phonics-based reading at all. And so then we got into therapy, we got the diagnosis of dyslexia, we got into tutoring, and I remember the first time she went to tutoring, she came out, she was in 2nd grade, she was 7 years old. She said, "You know, if someone had told me a long time ago that ing said ing and said re said re, it would have made a lot of sense to me because she is very black and white, very factual, and she doubled the number of words she could read in a minute after one session. She doubled it because
Of course she did. Those are word families,
right, right.
and they're how we chunk.
Mhm,
But so whole language versus, phonics.
mhm,
The Science of Reading, the National Reading Panel, all the studies, all of
mhm.
them, just suggest that a phonics-based reading approach is the most effective and efficient way to teach reading,
Absolutely.
period. Whole language,
Doesn't work.
we we have no evidence to support it.
I can tell you personally, it did not work with my daughter.
It didn't work with me either, but anyway, but I was from the '70s, and so it was, yeah, all the things. No, phonics has the evidence to support it. Linda Moot and her colleagues in the '70s
Mhm,
talked about how reading was, so taking written symbols
mhm,
and turning them into a linguistic code was not natural. There was nothing natural about it, and that 75% of children would learn to read in spite of what we did. So
hmm,
75% of the kids, the whole language, you expose them, they're going to figure it out.
mhm.
25% will not.
That's a big number.
That 75% is gonna learn in spite of what we do. So we can
Mhm.
teach phonics and they're gonna learn to read, probably faster and quicker.
Probably much quicker.
I haven't looked at those studies that compared that, but so it doesn't matter what we do for that 75%. So phonics works for them too. Whole language will not work for 25%, but a quarter of the population does not have a language impairment.
Mhm. Yeah. Wow.
It's because reading is the hardest thing we're gonna ask our baby's brains to do.
Yeah. And I feel like that expectation is placed on kids much sooner now. And sometimes I think their brains are not quite ready to do what we're asking them to do. If you look at the kindergarten curriculum now, some of the things they're asking them to do with segmenting and blending, I mean, some of these kids have turned 5 in August and their little brains are little. And I feel like sometimes what we're asking them to do is too hard. Do you feel that way or no?
I so what we know about rhyming is that 3-year-olds should be able to identify rhyme. Only about 50%, Bradley and Brian, I think, in their early work in the '80s, found that like 50% of kindergartner would be able to segment words into sound. One of the things that we know about reading instruction is that when we teach people how to do it, then they become better at those things. You know what I
Mhm.
mean?
Right.
And so the typical kindergartner, if we teach them to start pounding out syllables, top hat, cowboy, and we start showing them how to do that, especially with dichotic words, so that,
Mhm.
2 words, equal syllable, that makes sense. We can show them pictures. It's all good.
Right.
And we start teaching those skills and they become better at it.
Mhm.
That's for a typical brain. For children with language impairment, children who are neurodivergent with ADHD or any of those things, it is going to be much more difficult for them. And I don't have evidence to support this, but we do know that neurological maturation does make a difference.
Mhm. Right.
It doesn't mean that we don't expose them, but the problem with the class not the problem with the classroom. Classrooms are great. My parents were teachers. Love the classroom. I love public school teachers, but the problem is they have this whole group of kids. And if
Mhm.
they're doing group work in kindergarten, during, circle time and they're pounding out words, how do they identify those kids that aren't just clapping
Right.
and those kids who get it? And there are ways to do that. Dibbles, some of the screenings that we employ in our classrooms lets us quickly assess,
Right.
but the school has to have resources to do that because teachers can't.
Right.
And they can do smaller group work, and they do, and those types of things, and you start to get a feel, but but that smaller group work, they have a limited amount of time to teach those things.
Mhm.
And Stawich and his colleagues just found that it's intensive work, that those kids, so 25% of the kids are gonna will need phonics,
They're gonna
okay,
need
and in
more
that
support.
25% are the kids with language impairment.
Mhm.
And so if we give so 10% of the 25, when we give phonics, they're gonna join the other 75, so we have 85% of the kids in the classroom that can read, can learn to read, are making good progress. Some might need a little bit more time with some skills than others, but they're gonna get it. It's
Mhm.
that 10 to 15% of our population that's gonna need additional work,
And
intensive work.
then you throw in there kids who have articulation disorders. And I feel so inadequate as a speech pathologist to I don't know how to teach someone how to read, Dee. Like, I don't. I don't know how to teach someone to read a word. I know how to teach articulation therapy. So how does that articulation piece and that phonics piece, how do they play into each other? And what can we do as speech pathologists? And I've been practicing 25 years. I've raised a child. I didn't really teach her how to read. The tutor taught her how to read. But how do we work as speech pathologists on all with our students that have difficulties with language, who have weaknesses in phonics, and then you throw on top of that an articulation error.
Well, so as a speech language pathologist, we cannot be competent in everything. We can't.
Right. And
Don't give me a swallowing
I have
patient.
to remind myself that, I'm
Yeah,
not a reading teacher.
and there are so many people, well, I say that, that was an over exaggeration. There are people in your school district probably who have expertise in working with children with reading impairment.
Mhm.
You are the person who is working with someone with a language impairment.
Right.
Okay, and what we know, Sally Saywich and her colleagues suggested that, there's this kids who have phonological deficits or kids are gonna have problems with decoding,
Mhm.
and kids who have semantic, syntactic, and discourse deficits are gonna have problems with comprehension.
Mhm.
And so it's that language impairment. And so we certainly can help with and what we know about reading is that children who have a high vocabulary or semantic ability, word knowledge is the best predictor of reading comprehension.
Mhm. And that was my daughter, despite the dyslexia.
She had a robust
Mhm.
linguistic system with robust vocabulary, and so she could understand what she was being told.
Mhm.
If she had the time to read something and spend with the written language, she probably could understand it then too.
Right. It just took her longer to
That
decode
last
those words.
Yeah, no, they're moving too fast.
Mhm.
So, what can you do as a speech language pathologist? Well, some of it's gonna be continuing ed, because there are
Mhm.
all kinds of webinars and things just so this is phonemic awareness.
Mhm.
This is this is the early skills. As a speech language pathologist, I leverage my knowledge about the sound system in terms of sonorants and obstruents, and that if I'm going to work with a child trying to teach the to set up some stimuli,
Mhm.
and I want them to both read and say the words, then I'm going to use that information and put obstruents or those true consonants together
Mhm.
so that they can separate them, because when I put them with semivowels, the vowel attaches to a consonant somewhere, and they're
Mhm.
harder to separate.
It's harder. Mhm.
Yes.
Yep.
So breaking it apart becomes more difficult. And so without a doubt, depending upon your words and the child's deficit, you could have them sound out the word that has the picture, so there's some little things that we can do to support reading when
Mhm.
we work with children with artic disorders. But you need to work closely with your reading specialist
Mhm.
if that's a track you want to take, and it initially takes time. But once you understand what it is that they want to do and you all have a nice collaboration and are working together, and you've done a little bit of work in terms of phonemic awareness, decoding, all the things,
Mhm.
then it just becomes automatic
Right.
that you're doing those
And
things.
it becomes part of your therapy.
And it's not an extra goal. It's not anything extra. It's just so when I with preschoolers, and I've done this for years since I understood the power of rhyme. You know, Let's sit down, clown. Oh, I said that funny. Let's
Yeah.
get up, pup. Let's
Mhm.
go, Joe.
Yep.
Just, so that just becomes part of how I interact with the kids, that
Mhm.
rhyming is part of some of my directives, and it makes it a little bit more fun. We can laugh
Right.
at Miss D because she's talking in rhyme today.
Right.
You rhyme a word? Do these words rhyme? And then get on with my lesson.
Right.
You know what I mean? I'm not dwelling on that, but I'm exposing them
Right.
to that. I'm starting to use those words. I'm starting to use those things together. It's just and when I work with a preschooler and even early elementary, like kindergartners, that's gonna be my demeanor with them.
Right. I love that.
And it's all about language.
All about language. So speaking of language and all about language, I am working in California. I work with a lot of bilingual speakers.
Okay.
Let's talk about those students who are multilingual because you talked in our intro call about second language acquisition and you said that it takes, I think you said 9 years for a
9
child to be
years
proficient in
in academic
expository.
language. Yes.
Mhm. So
A minimum,
a minimum of 9 years.
minimum of 9 years of immersion.
The simultaneous translation is not really the up and coming research. Back in the day, that's what you did, the simultaneous translation. If I ask you to bring me your shoes in English, then say it in the second language. But they're saying the research now says that's too much. That's too much input. So there's the OPAL technique, the one person, one language, those kinds of things. But how, as speech pathologists, do we work with those students in speech and language therapy who don't speak English?
If I could answer that question, I would be able to make some money. I am not a bilingual therapist, and so for me to do too much talking would be for me talking outside of my scope outside of my expertise and competency. But what I know about children in second language acquisition is that there typically is a period of silence once they are immersed into
Mhm.
that. But language is language, and we have to go back to how we know that language is learned, and that's through exposure. That's through meeting, acquiring a critical mass
Mhm.
of having input that equals a critical mass, and we don't know what that how much input everybody needs, and it varies. It varies based on memory, it varies based on the ability to learn, whether it's in English or Spanish, and so there's so many variables there that you don't have the answers to. And
Right,
how do we make those determinations?
right.
Westby has done some good work in this area, Carol Westby, just in terms of dynamic assessment. And
Yes,
so, you know, spending some time and doing what I called when I started out diagnostic therapy.
right.
You know, so
Where you're playing with them, you're trying to play
it's
with
like
them to figure out what they know and what they don't know.
and can they so if I teach them to do something, do they remember?
Right.
Do they apply it then to a similar but new situation?
Mhm.
And those give me clues about, their ability to learn and their ability to learn language. And so if I teach them a word or a carrier phrase or a sentence
Mhm.
they can use to request things or to get someone's attention, and then they use it. It's like, oh, okay. So this feels like it's not the ability to learn language.
Right, it's not.
It is truly a difference, and so this may not be a job for me, this may be a job for, an ESL specialist
Mhm.
and time.
And time. Right. Thank you for tuning in to SLP Full Disclosure. You can learn more about this episode and our show on our website at amnhealthcare.com. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend and subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast platform. You can also find show updates and SLP opportunities on our Instagram at AMN Allied. Special thanks to AMN Healthcare for making this show possible. See y'all next time.